The businessman would be arrested. But the driver showed the evidence that changed everything. Richard Armstrong felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he sat waiting in the defendant's seat. The prosecutor had just presented the most serious charges a construction businessman could face. Embezzlement of funds intended for the renovation of the Children's Hospital in Aspen, the town where his company had operated for over 30 years. That's when David Thompson, his driver for 2 decades, stood up in the middle of the crowded hearing, holding a manila envelope that no one expected to see. The 62-year-old man, wearing his impeccable navy blue uniform, broke the tense silence of the courtroom with a firm voice that echoed throughout the room. "Your Honor, I have evidence that could change everything that has been said here today," declared David, ignoring the surprised looks from those present. Judge William Carson, an experienced man with graying hair, adjusted his glasses and observed the unusual scene. Lawyers whispered among themselves, while journalists pointed their cameras at the driver who had dared to interrupt a trial. "Mr. Thompson, you are not authorized to speak at this moment," said Counselor Jennifer Armstrong, Richard's daughter and responsible for his defense. Her eyes revealed nervousness, as if she feared what the driver might reveal. Richard turned to David with an expression of surprise and gratitude. That man had been more than an employee over the years. He was the one who drove him home every night, who knew his schedules, his worries, and who had witnessed every moment of the construction of the empire that was now in ruins. Prosecutor Michael Bennett, a young and ambitious man, tried to protest, but the judge raised his hand asking for silence. Experience told him that moments like that could be decisive for justice. "I allow you to speak, but be brief and to the point," decided the magistrate. David walked to the center of the courtroom with confident steps, carrying not only documents, but 20 years of loyalty and observation. His eyes met Richard's, and a silent understanding passed between them. "Your Honor, my name is David Thompson. I have worked for Mr. Richard for 20 years, and during all that time I have followed every move of the company. In the last 6 months, I began to notice strange things," he began, his voice filled with contained emotion. Elizabeth Armstrong, Richard's wife of 35 years, clasped her hands in her lap. Her blue eyes reflected a mixture of hope and apprehension. She knew that David would never lie, but she feared what he might have discovered. "What kind of strange things?" asked the judge, leaning forward. "Documents being signed without Mr. Richard reading them, meetings happening without him knowing, bank transfers that he was completely unaware of," revealed David, opening the envelope and taking out a stack of carefully organized papers. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." The atmosphere in the courtroom changed instantly. Murmurs began to spread among those present, while Richard's family exchanged worried looks. Olivia Parker, his 17-year-old granddaughter, was sitting next to her grandmother, watching everything with the curiosity typical of her age. "Mr. Thompson, these are very serious accusations," said the prosecutor, trying to regain control of the situation. "They're not accusations, Counselor. They're facts," replied David, showing the first document. "This here is a copy of a bank transfer of $2 million made on March 15th of this year. The signature is Mr. Richard's, but he was hospitalized that day because of pneumonia." Richard felt the blood run cold in his veins. He remembered that hospitalization perfectly. Elizabeth had insisted he see a doctor after 3 days of high fever, and he had stayed in the hospital for a whole week. "This is impossible," murmured Richard, rising from his seat. "Sit down, Dad," whispered Jennifer, but her voice trembled in a way that didn't go unnoticed. David continued, unperturbed. His posture was that of a man who had meticulously prepared for that moment. "There's more, Your Honor. During those months I started recording conversations, not out of malice, but because something told me that Mr. Richard was being deceived by people close to him. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next revelation. Richard looked at his family, trying to understand who could have betrayed him so cruelly. "Do you have these recordings here?" asked the judge. "Yes, sir," replied David, taking a small digital recorder from his pocket. "This one was made 3 weeks ago, at the company office. The sound that echoed through the courtroom chilled the blood of everyone present. It was a conversation between two people, one of whom everyone recognized immediately. "We need to speed up the transfers before the old man suspects anything. I already got his signature on 5 more documents yesterday. And if he finds out, he won't find out. He trusts me completely. Besides, when all this blows up, he'll be the only one to blame." Richard felt his legs weaken. That voice, it was from someone he considered like a son. His eyes turned to Brian Miller, his son-in-law of 10 years, who was sitting in the witness stand with an increasingly pale face. Elizabeth brought her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race. She had always had a bad feeling about Jennifer's husband, but she had never imagined her suspicions were so well-founded. "Was this recording obtained legally?" questioned Brian's defense attorney, who had remained silent until then. "It was made in the company office where I've worked for 20 years, sir. Mr. Richard always gave me full access to the premises because he trusted me," David replied with dignity. Jennifer looked at her husband with an expression of shock and disbelief. Her brown eyes, so similar to her father's, filled with tears as she tried to process the magnitude of the betrayal. "Brian, tell me this isn't true," she whispered, but her voice was heard throughout the courtroom due to the absolute silence that reigned. Brian Miller, a 40-year-old man who looked like he had always lived comfortably, tried to maintain his composure, but the sweat on his forehead gave him away. "Jennifer, you can't believe this. It's a setup," he murmured, but his voice lacked the necessary conviction. David wasn't finished. With the precision of someone who had planned every move, he took more documents from the envelope. "Your Honor, I also have here copies of emails exchanged between Mr. Brian and the company accountant, Raymond Cooper. In them, it's clear how the transfers were made without Mr. Richard's knowledge." The accountant, a 50-year-old man who was present at the hearing as a witness, began to tremble visibly. Raymond Cooper had worked for the company for 15 years and had always been considered trustworthy. "Mr. Cooper, would you like to make a statement?" asked the judge, noticing the accountant's state. Raymond swallowed hard and looked alternately at Brian and Richard. His eyes revealed the weight of a conscience tormented for months. I was coerced, Your Honor," he began, his voice choked. "Mr. Brian threatened me. He said that if I didn't cooperate, he would make up irregularities in my work and I would be fired without any severance." Richard felt as if the world were crashing down around him. Not only was he being betrayed by his son-in-law, but also by the accountant he had blindly trusted for over a decade. "What kind of coercion?" insisted the judge. "He said he knew about some loans I took out at the bank without sufficient collateral, that he could complicate things for me if I didn't help with the transfers," confessed Raymond, tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Armstrong, I apologize. I never meant to harm you. You were always fair to me and my family." Elizabeth could no longer hold back her tears. Seeing her husband betrayed so cruelly by people they considered family was more than she could bear. David, realizing the moment had come to present his most damning evidence, pulled a tablet from the envelope. "Your Honor, I also have videos from the office security cameras, Mr. Armstrong always made it clear that the cameras were for our protection, but they ended up recording something very important." The tablet was connected to the courtroom's sound system, and everyone could see the recording. In it, Brian clearly appeared forging Richard's signature on several documents, while Raymond watched nervously. "This is from last week," explained David. "Mr. Armstrong was in New York City, visiting a new project, and Mr. Brian took the opportunity to sign several contracts on his behalf. The image was crystal clear and left no room for doubt. Brian was clearly imitating his father-in-law's signature with a skill that suggested extensive practice." Jennifer stood up abruptly, her eyes fixed on her husband with a mixture of anger and despair. "How could you do this?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "My father gave you everything. He gave you a position in the company, treated you like a son." Brian tried to approach her, but Jennifer recoiled as if his presence contaminated her. "Jennifer, you don't understand. I did this for us, for our family. Your father was never going to give me the position I deserved in the company," said Brian, finally revealing his true nature. "The position you deserved." Richard stood up, his voice filled with deep pain. "I made you financial director 2 years after you married my daughter. I gave you a salary many executives would love to have. How was that not enough?" Brian looked around, realizing there was no way to maintain the charade any longer. His mask of the devoted son-in-law had finally fallen. "Because I would never be more than the son-in-law. I would always be seen as someone who was there because of the marriage," he replied bitterly. "I wanted to build something that was mine, understand? Build something by stealing from me?" Richard's voice rose, filled with an indignation that echoed throughout the courtroom. David watched the scene with sadness. He had witnessed many conversations between Richard and Brian, always seeing the boss trying to include the son-in-law in the company's important decisions. "Mr. Armstrong always treated Mr. Brian like a son," said David, addressing the judge. "I was present in meetings where he explained every detail of the business to Mr. Brian, trying to prepare him for greater responsibilities in the future." Olivia, Richard's granddaughter, who had until then observed everything in silence, approached her grandfather and held his hand. "Grandpa, I knew you would never do something like this," she said, with the premature wisdom of someone who had grown up seeing her grandfather's integrity. The granddaughter's presence seemed to give Richard strength, and he looked around the courtroom with renewed dignity. "Your Honor, throughout my entire life, I built my company based on honesty and hard work. Never at any point would I divert money intended for the children's hospital. Those children depend on that renovation to receive proper treatment." The prosecutor, Michael Bennett, who initially seemed confident in convicting Richard, now found himself in a difficult position. The evidence presented by David completely changed the course of the case. "Your Honor, I request a recess to analyze this new evidence," he asked, clearly shaken. The judge agreed, but before temporarily adjourning the session, he addressed David. "Mr. Thompson, why did you decide to keep this evidence? What motivated you to investigate on your own?" David looked at Richard with the loyalty of someone who had dedicated 2 decades of his life to that man. "Your Honor, Mr. Richard gave me opportunities that few employers would give. When my wife got sick, he paid for her treatment. When my son needed to study, he offered a scholarship. This man is honorable, and I couldn't let them destroy his life based on lies." David's words echoed through the courtroom, creating an emotional silence. Many of those present remembered similar stories about Richard Armstrong's generosity over the years. During the recess, Elizabeth approached David in the courthouse hallway. "David, we have no words to thank you for what you did," she said with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Armstrong, I only did what was right." "Mr. Richard didn't deserve to go through this," he replied, demonstrating the humility that had always characterized him. Meanwhile, Jennifer confronted Brian in a private room. "How did you manage to deceive all of us for so long?" she asked, her voice mixing pain and anger. "It wasn't hard. You all trusted me completely," replied Brian, showing no remorse. "And it worked for a long time." "It worked?" Jennifer stared at him in disbelief. "You destroyed our family, our company, almost sent my father to prison, and you think it worked?" "If it weren't for that meddling driver, everything would have gone as planned," said Brian, revealing a coldness Jennifer had never noticed. It was at this moment that Jennifer understood she had never really known the man she married. The person she loved was a carefully constructed illusion. Olivia, who had followed her mother, overheard part of the conversation and entered the room. "Mom, you can't be near him. He hurt Grandpa," said the teenager with surprising maturity for her age. Brian looked at his daughter, and for the first time a shadow of regret passed through his eyes. "Olivia, I did all this thinking of you too, so you could have a better future," he tried to justify himself. "A better future?" Olivia stared at him with contempt. "You almost sent my grandfather to prison. How would that give me a better future?" The teenager's moral integrity contrasted drastically with her father's character corruption, making it clear how Richard had positively influenced his granddaughter's upbringing. When the hearing resumed, the prosecutor had completely changed his stance. The evidence presented by David was irrefutable, and he had no choice but to acknowledge the error of the initial charges. "Your Honor, after analyzing the evidence presented by Mr. David Thompson, The prosecution acknowledges that the charges against Mr. Richard Armstrong were based on false information and fraudulent documents. The relief on Richard's face was visible, but there was also a deep sadness for the years of trust that had been broken. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The judge, after examining all the evidence, had no doubts about his decision. Considering the evidence presented, this court fully acquits Mr. Richard Armstrong of all charges. Moreover, I order the preventive detention of Mr. Brian Miller for document forgery, embezzlement and fraud. Brian was handcuffed right there in the courtroom, while Jennifer watched silently, torn between the pain of betrayal and relief for her father's innocence. After the court's decision, the family gathered in the courthouse corridors. Richard embraced David with tears in his eyes. "David, you saved more than my freedom. You saved my dignity and my family," said Richard, moved. "Mr. Richard, you gave me a dignified life. It was the least I could do," replied David, also emotional. Elizabeth approached the two men, her eyes still moist with tears. "David, from today on, you are not just our employee. You are part of our family," she said, hugging the driver who had become the family's hero. Olivia, always perceptive for her age, made a remark that would define that moment. "Grandpa, your David is proof that good people still exist in this world." Richard looked at his granddaughter with pride, realizing she had learned a valuable lesson about loyalty and integrity. In the days following the trial, David's story spread throughout the city of Aspen. People talked about the driver who had saved his boss from prison, demonstrating a loyalty that had become rare in modern times. Richard's company underwent a complete restructuring. New controls were implemented, and David was promoted to supervision manager, a position created especially for him. "David, I want you to oversee all the company's financial operations," said Richard, during a meeting at the construction company's headquarters. "Your honesty and attention to detail are exactly what we need to rebuild trust." David accepted the new responsibility with the seriousness that had always characterized his work, but this time with an authority that everyone in the company deeply respected. Jennifer started the divorce process and moved back into her parents' house with Olivia. The home, which had been a happy place for so many years, slowly regained its atmosphere of peace and family unity. "Sweetheart, I know it's hard, but you made the right decision," said Elizabeth, comforting Jennifer one afternoon when she seemed particularly down. "Mom, what hurts the most is knowing I lived with a person who never really existed. Brian was a persona, a representation of what he thought he should be," reflected Jennifer, showing a painful maturity gained through experience. Olivia, who was listening to the conversation from the next room, approached the two women. "Mom, at least now you know who the people are that truly love you. Grandpa, Grandma, me, and even your David, who risked everything to save our family." The teenager's wisdom constantly surprised the adults around her, showing how the traumatic experience had further matured her understanding of human relationships. The children's hospital construction resumed with full transparency. Richard implemented a system where all transactions were monitored by an independent committee, with David as one of the main supervisors. "I want this project to be an example of how to do business the right way," said Richard during the ceremony to resume construction. "These children deserve the best we can offer." The community, which had initially doubted Richard due to the accusations, now supported him even more fervently. The story of his innocence and David's loyalty had deeply touched the town's residents. Dr. Joseph Fitzgerald, director of the Children's Hospital, made sure to publicly express his gratitude. "Mr. Richard, your integrity and Mr. David's honesty have restored our faith in human nature. This hospital will be built on a foundation of solid trust," he said during the ceremony. Months later, when the hospital was nearly completed, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone. "David, I want to make you a minority partner in the company," he announced during a family meeting. David was speechless, looking back and forth between Richard and Elizabeth, who smiled approvingly at her husband's decision. "Mr. Armstrong, I can't accept this. I only did my duty," protested David, ever modest. "David, You did much more than your duty. You saved our family and our company. Besides, I need someone I trust completely as a partner," insisted Richard. Elizabeth stood up and placed her hand on David's shoulder. "David, accept it. You deserve this and much more," she said, with the sweetness that always characterized her. Jennifer, who had remained silent during the conversation, finally spoke up. "David, my father is right. You're not just a loyal employee. You're someone who put truth above any personal interest. That's rare nowadays." Olivia, always direct, summed up everyone's feeling. "Mr. Thompson, just accept it already. You're part of the family anyway," she said, drawing laughter from everyone present. David's acceptance was accompanied by tears of emotion. That simple man, who had dedicated his life to honest work, was now becoming a partner in a company he had helped save. "I accept, Mr. Armstrong, but on one condition," said David, regaining his composure. "What condition?" asked Richard, intrigued. "That I continue to be your driver, too. I like taking care of you and the family," replied David, showing that prosperity hadn't changed his essence. Richard laughed, hugging David once again. "Deal, partner," he said, using a word that sealed not just a business partnership, but a lifelong partnership based on mutual trust. The opening of the Children's Hospital became a landmark event for Aspen. Richard made sure David cut the ribbon alongside him, symbolizing that this project had been possible thanks to the honesty of both. "This project represents more than a hospital," said Richard during his speech. "It represents the victory of truth over lies, loyalty over betrayal, and honesty over corruption." David, invited to speak, moved everyone with his simple but profound words. "I only did what my mother taught me. Always tell the truth, no matter how hard it is. Mr. Armstrong gave me opportunities in life, and it was my duty to protect him when he needed it most." The children at the hospital, some already admitted for treatment, watched the ceremony from their room windows, waving to Richard and David, who had made more dignified treatment possible for them. Dr. Margaret Wilson, the hospital's head pediatrician, made sure to show the new facilities to Richard and David. "You two have changed the lives of hundreds of children. This equipment we have now can save lives we couldn't help before," she said, showing them the modern surgical center. Richard looked around, seeing the colorful, well-equipped rooms, and felt a satisfaction that transcended any business profit. "David, do you know what makes me proudest about this project?" asked Richard, watching a 5-year-old child playing in her new room. "What, Mr. Armstrong?" "Knowing that it was built without a single stain on our conscience. Every brick here was laid with honesty." David nodded, perfectly understanding his friend and partner's feeling. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. Months later, Brian was sentenced to 6 years in prison for his crimes. During the trial, he tried to implicate other people, but the evidence collected by David was so precise that it left no room for doubt about his sole guilt. Raymond Cooper, the accountant, received a lighter sentence due to his cooperation and because he had been coerced. Richard, demonstrating his generous nature, offered to help him restart his life in another city. "Mr. Armstrong, why are you helping me after what I did?" asked Raymond, emotional during a conversation in the company office. "Raymond, you made a mistake out of fear, not greed. Everyone deserves a second chance when they acknowledge their mistakes," replied Richard, showing the wisdom of someone who had been through a great ordeal. David, present during the conversation, watched how Richard handled with compassion even those who had harmed him. "You are an example to all of us, Mr. Armstrong," said David, admiring his friend's greatness of character. Armstrong Construction became a benchmark for transparency and business ethics. Business administration students began visiting the company to understand how it had recovered from a crisis through honesty. During one of these visits, a young student asked David about his motivation for exposing the truth. "Mr. Thompson, wasn't it difficult to decide to expose your own boss?" asked the young man. "Son, I wasn't exposing my boss, I was protecting him. The difference is that I knew who Mr. Armstrong really was, and I knew he would never do what they were accusing him of," replied David, with the serenity of someone who had made the right choice. Richard, who was listening from afar, approached the group. "The lesson you should take from here is simple. Honesty may be painful in the moment, but it always prevails in the end," he told the students. Olivia, now 18 and studying law, often accompanied these visits, having chosen her career inspired by the experience her family went through. "I decided to become a lawyer because of what happened to my grandfather," she told the visitors. "I want to defend honest people who are unfairly accused." The young woman had become one of the main defenders of Richard and David's story, telling it whenever possible to show that justice still exists. Elizabeth, now 68, had found new energy through overcoming the family crisis. She had dedicated herself to social work at the Children's Hospital, organizing events to raise funds for additional improvements. "Richard, do you know what makes me happiest in all of this?" she said during a family dinner. "What, my love?" "It's seeing how our family became even closer after everything we went through. And we gained a son," she said, looking affectionately at David, who was dining with them as had become customary. David, always moved by the family's displays of affection, smiled timidly. "Mrs. Armstrong, you gave me a family I never thought I would have," he said, referring to the fact that he had lost his wife years before and had no children. Jennifer, who had emotionally recovered from the betrayal, made an observation that touched everyone. "David, you showed us that family isn't just about blood. It's about loyalty. It's about affection. It's about being there in difficult times." Richard's daughter's reflection echoed through the room, reminding everyone how true bonds are formed through actions, not just kinship. 1 year after the trial, the company received the award for Most Ethical Company in California, an honor that Richard attributed entirely to David. "This award isn't mine. It belongs to the man who had the courage to do what was right when everything seemed lost," said Richard during the awards ceremony, calling David to share the stage with him. David, wearing a new suit that Richard had insisted on buying for him, spoke briefly to the audience full of business people and journalists. "I've learned that honesty isn't a difficult choice when you truly know the character of the people you love. Knowing Mr. Armstrong for 20 years gave me the certainty that he would never do anything wrong." The simplicity and sincerity of David contrasted with the elaborate speeches typical of that kind of event, deeply touching everyone present. 2 years later, when the Children's Hospital was completely operational and had saved hundreds of lives, Richard made a decision that surprised the family. "I'm going to retire," he announced during a family meeting. "Dad, you're only 65, protested Jennifer. "Exactly. I want to enjoy my healthy years with my family and travel with Elizabeth. Besides, I have a completely trustworthy partner to take care of the company," said Richard, looking at David. David was momentarily speechless at the responsibility being placed on his shoulders. "Mr. Armstrong, I don't know if I'm ready to take on so much," he said, with the humility that had always characterized him. "David, you've been ready your whole life. You just didn't know it," replied Richard, with the confidence of someone who knew his friend's character deeply. The transition was gradual and smooth. Richard remained as an advisor, but David effectively took over the management of the company, surprising everyone with his natural administrative ability. Olivia, who had graduated from law, began working as the company's lawyer, creating an internal legal department to ensure everything was always done with absolute legality. "Grandpa, now we have a lawyer in the family to protect you and your David from any problems," she joked during a meeting. The young woman had inherited not only her grandfather's intelligence, but also his moral integrity, becoming a respected professional in the city. Elizabeth and Richard began traveling across the United States, visiting social projects and hospitals, always accompanied by David when possible. The trips became a way to give back to society all the success they had achieved. During a visit to an orphanage in Colorado, Richard made an observation that revealed how the experience had changed his life perspective. "Elizabeth, do you know what I've learned from everything we've been through?" he said, watching children play in the institution's courtyard. "What, my love?" "That true wealth isn't in what we build, but in the people we have by our side and the peace of mind we carry." Elizabeth held her husband's hand, feeling the same peace he expressed. "And to think we almost lost everything because of one person's ambition who didn't know how to value what they had," she reflected. David, who was accompanying them on the visit, heard the conversation and made an observation that would remain etched in everyone's memory. "Mrs. Armstrong, I think we didn't lose anything. Actually, we gained. We discovered who we really were and what's truly important." David's simple but profound words perfectly summarized the journey they had all taken. 5 years after the trial, Brian was released from prison. He tried to approach Olivia, who was now an established lawyer and mother of a young boy. "Olivia, I know I made mistakes, but I'm your father," he said during a chance encounter on the street. Olivia looked at him with the maturity of someone who had grown up surrounded by examples of integrity. "Brian, you were my biological father, but the one who raised me, taught me values, and showed me what it means to be an honest person was my grandfather. And the one who showed me what true loyalty is was David," she replied firmly but without cruelty. Olivia's response reflected how she had processed the entire family experience in a healthy way, managing to distinguish between biological kinship and the truly formative relationships of her life. Brian understood that he had lost much more than his freedom with his actions. He had lost the opportunity to witness the growth of an extraordinary daughter. On the 6th anniversary of Richard's acquittal, the family organized a special celebration. The event brought together company employees, doctors from the Children's Hospital, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the story of honesty and loyalty. David, now a respected businessman, gave a speech that moved everyone present. "6 years ago, I was just a driver who wanted to protect his boss. Today, I'm a partner in a thriving company, but more important than that, I'm part of a family that has shown me that loyalty still has value in this world." Richard, emotional, embraced David in front of all the guests. "David, you didn't just save my freedom that day in court. You saved my faith in humanity," he said, with tears in his eyes. Olivia, now a mother and successful lawyer, raised a toast that summarized the feeling of everyone present. "To my grandfather, who taught us that integrity is worth more than any fortune. To my grandmother, who showed us that true love overcomes any adversity. To my mother, who had the courage to choose what was right even when it was painful. And to Uncle David, who proved to us that there are angels disguised as ordinary people." The toast was accompanied by warm applause from everyone present, sealing a story that had become legend in the town of Aspen. Elizabeth, observing the gathered family, made a reflection that deeply touched everyone. "Do you know what makes me proudest in all of this?" she said, looking around the table full of smiling faces. "What, Grandma?" asked Olivia. "It's knowing that little Jack," she said, referring to her 2-year-old great-grandson, "will grow up hearing this story. He'll learn from an early age that honesty and loyalty are the most important values we can have." The boy, Olivia's son, was in David's lap, who had become the adoptive grandfather he never had biologically. "Uncle David will tell him many stories," said Olivia, watching the scene affectionately. David shook his head, looking at the child in his arms. "I'll tell him about his great-grandfather, who built an empire based on honesty, about his great-grandmother, who kept the family united in the most difficult times, and about his mother, who chose the right path even when it was hard. And about you, David?" asked Richard. "About me, I'll tell him that there is honor in any work when done with dedication and honesty, and that loyalty is the most valuable gift we can give someone," replied David, demonstrating the simple wisdom that had always characterized him. The conversation was interrupted by a call that would once again change the family's life. It was from the mayor of Aspen, announcing that the town wanted to honor Richard and David with a street in their names. "Mr. Richard, the town wants to create Loyalty Street in honor of you and Mr. David," said the mayor through the speakerphone. Richard looked at David, who seemed incredulous at the honor. "I accept, but only if it's David Thompson Street. He deserves all the recognition," said Richard, once again demonstrating his gratitude. "No, Mr. Richard. If we're to accept, let it be Richard Armstrong and David Thompson Street, because this story is ours, not mine," insisted David. The friendly discussion about the tribute showed how both men had remained humble, despite all the recognition received. The street inauguration took place on the 10th anniversary of Richard's acquittal. The ceremony brought together hundreds of people, including patients from the Children's Hospital, who had been saved thanks to the facilities funded by the company. Dr. Joseph Fitzgerald, who still ran the hospital, gave a moving speech about the impact of the project on the children's lives. In 10 years, this hospital has saved over 2,000 lives. Each of these children owes their second chance to the integrity of these two men, he said, pointing to Richard and David. One of the children saved by the hospital, now a 15-year-old teenager, approached the two men to thank them personally. "Mr. Richard and Mr. David, I wanted to thank you. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here today," said Emily, a young woman who had undergone heart surgery at the hospital when she was little. Richard and David were touched by the young woman's testimony, understanding once again the true impact of their actions. Olivia, now a lawyer specializing in defending the innocent, had been inspired by the family's story to dedicate her career to similar cases. She had managed to acquit dozens of wrongly accused people, always using the lessons learned from her grandfather's experience. "Grandpa, every innocent person I managed to defend is a way to honor what you and Uncle David went through," she would say during family dinners. Richard was immensely proud of his granddaughter, seeing in her the continuation of family values. "Olivia, you're doing more than honoring our history, you're creating your own story of justice," he would reply, with the typical pride of a dedicated grandfather. David, now 70 years old, had become a respected figure in the New York City business world. He was often invited to give talks on ethics and loyalty, always telling his story in a simple and straightforward way. During one of these talks at a university, a student asked a question that made him reflect deeply. "Mr. David, weren't you afraid of losing your job when you exposed your boss's son-in-law?" David thought for a moment before answering. "Son, I was more afraid of losing my dignity than my job. Jobs we can find others, but dignity, once lost, is very hard to regain." The simple but profound answer became one of the most quoted phrases about business ethics on the university's social media. Richard, even retired, continued to oversee the company's business as an advisor. He had implemented a scholarship program for employees' children, inspired by the gratitude he felt for David. "I want all our employees to have the same opportunities we gave David over the years," he explained during a meeting with managers. The program became a model for other companies in the region, showing how investing in people generates positive results for everyone. Elizabeth, at 75 years old, had become an active volunteer in several charitable institutions. Her experience of almost losing her husband had motivated her to dedicate more time to helping other families in difficulty. "Richard, do you know what I discovered doing volunteer work?" she told him during a morning walk. "What, my love?" "That our story gives hope to many people who are going through hard times. They see that it's possible to overcome adversity while maintaining dignity." Elizabeth's observation showed how her personal experience had become a source of inspiration for others. 10 years after the trial, Brian tried once again to approach the family. He had served his sentence and apparently reflected on his mistakes. He wrote a letter to Richard, asking for forgiveness and an opportunity to talk. Richard, after consulting the family, decided to meet with his former son-in-law in a neutral location, accompanied by David. "Brian, why did you want to see me?" asked Richard, without hostility but with caution. "Mr. Richard, I spent 10 years thinking about what I did. I want to ask for forgiveness and try in some way to repair the harm I caused," said Brian, apparently sincere in his remorse. David observed the conversation in silence, analyzing the sincerity of the former son-in-law's words. "Brian, forgiveness I can give, but trust, that is built with actions, not words," replied Richard, demonstrating wisdom gained through experience. "I understand. I don't expect immediate trust. I just wanted you to know that I recognize my mistakes and that I admire you even more after everything you've been through," said Brian. Richard looked at David, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. That silent complicity between the two men spoke of years of partnership and mutual trust. "Brian, you have forgiveness. As for the rest, time will tell," concluded Richard, ending the encounter with dignity. After Brian left, David made an observation that revealed his emotional maturity. "Mr. Richard, I think he is sincere. 10 years in prison can change a person." "Do you think we should give him a chance?" asked Richard. "I think we should observe. If he has really changed, his actions will show it. If he hasn't changed, they will show that too," replied David, with the practical wisdom that had always characterized him. The conversation showed how both men had maintained their capacity to forgive without losing the necessary prudence to protect their families. Olivia, when she learned of the meeting, had a reaction that surprised everyone. "Grandpa, I would like to talk with him too," she said during dinner. "Are you sure, honey?" asked Jennifer, worried about her daughter. "I am. I need to do this for myself. I want to see if I can see any genuine remorse in him," explained Olivia, demonstrating the maturity of someone who had grown up surrounded by examples of integrity. The meeting between Olivia and Brian was emotional for both. Brian saw in his daughter a strong and successful woman, and Olivia managed to perceive that her father had truly reflected on his mistakes. "Olivia, I missed the best years of your life because of my ambition. I don't ask you to forgive me, just to know that you are well," said Brian, with tears in his eyes. "Brian, I am well. I grew up surrounded by people who taught me solid values. Grandpa, Grandma, Mom, and Uncle David were my true guides," replied Olivia, without cruelty, but with clarity. "I know. And I am grateful to them for that," said Brian, demonstrating a humility that Olivia had never seen in him before. The meeting did not result in an immediate reconciliation, but it planted the seed of a possible future rebuilding of the father-daughter relationship. End of story. Tell us what you thought of this story of loyalty and integrity. Do you believe David made the right decision by exposing the truth? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories.